What's up, everybody? Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. So as you guys may or may not know, I am all for vulnerability. Like, that's what I built my platform on, and that's why a lot of you guys follow me, is just because of my heart for vulnerability and how I love talking about the hard things that I've gone through. So I've shared my testimony in like bits and pieces for years and years on social media, but I've never shared it like front to back, like the whole thing. So we're gonna get into it today. I'm finally gonna share my testimony with you guys. You guys have been asking me for it for years. So let's get right into it because it's gonna be a long video. I have a crazy testimony. There's a lot to unpack, so let's get into it. So I'm super honest about this part of my life. So I grew up with a very narcissistic and emotionally abusive father. My parents got divorced when I was like 3 or 4 years old. So they shared custody. They lived like right down the road basically from each other. And the brother that I grew up with had Asperger's and ADHD, and he had a lot of mental health things going on. And he required a lot of attention, and he was a lot. So I grew up in the type of context where at my dad's house, he just like was pretty narcissistic and like emotionally abusive, and I think he tried his best with his kids, with me and my brother Seth, but he still had narcissistic tendencies that have caused a lot of damage in me. So not only was he narcissistic, but he was also very, very, very strict. And then we have my mom's house, which is completely the polar opposite. Like, my mom was very warm and friendly and very like the opposite of strict. She just like would let anything go. So that was really hard to navigate as a child, the two different homes that I grew up in, one that was completely opposite from the other. And we would go back and forth every single day. It wasn't like 1 week on, 1 week off. I didn't realize it at the time, obviously, but it did end up causing a lot of damage in my brain that I'm unlearning as an adult. And another really important aspect I want to mention about my dad is he was really, really sick. And I grew up almost watching him die like dozens of times. He had a blood disorder called Oslo-Weber-Rendu syndrome, where he would just get really bad nosebleeds and he would lose like units of blood at a time. And he had diabetes, and he had so many health issues. I remember being a child when I very first begged the Lord to take my dad, to put him out of suffering. So I grew up in a household also that my parents loved the Lord. They would take us to church, but we weren't living like a Christian lifestyle. So for example, like my dad would take us to church on Sunday mornings and be abusive Sunday afternoons. So like I just never really saw either of my parents fully walking out their relationship with God. So because they took me to church since I was really young, probably even since I was born, I do believe that I was saved when I was really young. So that was just like the context of my childhood, basically. So I had my grandma, my mom's mom, who was literally my best friend. I loved her so, so much. She was, at one point in my life, she was my only safe person. She lived about 20 minutes away from us. So I tried to stay with her on the weekends because she just was incredible. She loved me so well. She cared for me. There were so many times she was protective over me. There were so many times where she actually called CPS on my dad because he was being just not a good person, and she was so protective over me. So that was my home life context, and the context of me in school was an absolute nightmare. I was so severely bullied to the point where a group of girls who actually were like my best friends, but like one day decided that they hated me. I don't really know why, but they just like ganged up on me and tried to shove me in front of a moving bus to try to kill me. So I just was like, I was scared to go to school where there was like physical abuse. I was scared to go home where there was emotional abuse or emotional neglect. So that's why my grandma meant everything to me, because I didn't feel safe at school or at home. So that's why I loved staying with her. So I was 12 years old when the first like huge tragedy happened in my life. Me and my brother were staying at my dad's house, and he came into my room one night at like 3 a.m. and said, hey, we have to get up, we have to get going, your mom's house is on fire. So we went right away, and the whole thing just like burned to the ground. Basically, there was literally nothing left that we can salvage. Thank God none of us were home that night. My mom was staying with her boyfriend at the time, and like I said, me and my brother were at my dad's, and thank God our cats were outdoor cats, so all we lost was our stuff. And it was incredibly traumatic, because I'll never forget, I still had to go to school that day, and it just was so traumatic. So while we were in the process of looking for a new home, we decided to move in with my grandma temporarily. And of course, I'm like, yes, like I get to see my grandma more often. I was so happy. Obviously traumatized at the fact that I had just lost my house, and like still to this day, I can smell what my house smelled like that night. But pretty much right after my family, me, my mom, and my brother moved in with my grandparents, we got the news that my grandma was dying of cancer, and we lost her pretty much like right away. So it was like one tragedy after the other. She was, you can imagine like how I'm telling you, she was like the safe person in my life. Like you can imagine how that felt, how crippling that was to lose my best friend and my protector. And she was more so like a parental figure to me. Even though she had her own like mental health issues, she just was the most incredible grandparent I could ever ask for. So that was the first huge loss. It was like world shattering to me. So at the time of my life, where after my grandma had passed away, after our house burned down, after all of that, I was just struggling so much, because it's really hard for a child to have a parent, my dad, who was sometimes really angry and abusive, but also sometimes like the best dad you could ever ask for. Like sometimes he was so full of love, and like he would come home from long work trips and we would jump in his arms and he would give us gifts, and we just were so happy to see him and spend time with him. So obviously that's really hard for a child to navigate. I never knew what version of my dad I was gonna get, and it was really hard to differentiate the two versions of my dad. So because of this there was like one specific day where it was really bad, and we had a big fight or something happened. I don't remember the specifics, but I do remember I went into my room and I broke a picture frame, and thus starting a long 5-year addiction of self-harm. So I was 14 at the time, and 14 was also the age that I got diagnosed with clinical depression. 14 was a really hard year for me. I think that was also the year that I attempted suicide for the first time. I don't really know what happened, but it just didn't work out, praise God. And that was also the year that, I think that was like my rebel year. That was the year that I just was so sick and tired of the abuse and the broken home life, and not getting emotional validation from my parents and emotional safety from my parents. So I decided to start sleeping around. So I think it was like my very first like boyfriend or whatever. I was 14 at the time too, that started sleeping with him. And then when like sleeping around wasn't filling the void, that's when I decided to start drugs. I never did hard drugs, but I smoked pot. I got drunk every other day. I was just in desperate search of something to fill the void. And after like the drugs and alcohol and stuff didn't fill the void, I decided I was bisexual, because the only man in my life that was supposed to protect me and supposed to be safe wasn't. So I just decided that men as a whole aren't safe. So I liked women, and I was almost in a relationship with one, slept around with men and women. I think the sexual brokenness actually started when I was sexually assaulted by a really close family friend's son, who was in his 30s at the time, and I think I was like maybe 13 or 14. And it was just like, it made me so uncomfortable. So I reached out for help, and I told my dad, and he talked to his parents, because like I said, they were really close. And I think my dad believed me, but they didn't believe me. So I think that was really really hard for me as a woman and as a child to not be believed, because there were a lot of things that I made up for attention. That's just what you do as a teenage girl that's lacking love and safety from your parents, but this was not one of them. And I will never forget the feeling that I felt the moment they told me that they didn't believe me. It literally felt like my world was crashing down. So I think that was kind of what started like my sexual brokenness. And from the ages of 14 to 17, I just was completely wildin'. Like I said, I was sleeping around, I was doing drugs, like I was doing it all in secret. At this point in my life, I didn't know whether I was a Satanist or atheist, but I knew I was one of them. And I leaned more towards Satanism because I just hated God. And I knew that Satan would give me the things that I wanted and he wouldn't hurt me or whatever. Like, just lies that I was believing as a teenager. So I literally hated God more than anything because I just never understood how he could allow me to go through so much as a child when, like, I'm supposed to be protected. I'm supposed to be loved. I'm supposed to be innocent. You know, like, the things that happened to me never should have happened to me. So because I saw myself just feeling validated and feeling loved and feeling wanted for the first time of my life, after sleeping around with men, I decided that was what I wanted to do with my life. So I decided I wanted to go into the porn industry as a performer. And I was researching how to do it, and I even started a porn account on Twitter, and I would like post porn, post my nudes and stuff just to like dip my toes in and see the kind of response that I got. And when I saw that it was good, I was like, yeah, this is it. This is what I want to do. Not realizing that all I wanted was to be validated and I wanted to feel seen and I didn't want to be overlooked. I wanted to be loved. And there was like not a single person in my life who could give me that, at least to the extent that I needed. Because even the most loving parents cannot love you to the extent that you need. Only Jesus can do that. Every single void is God-sized. And I wish that is something I learned as a child. So there were, I think, 4 times in a whole that I attempted suicide. And one time I was at my dad's house, and since I had my addiction to self-harm, that was how I attempted suicide. And I genuinely don't even remember what happened. I don't know who made the call, but I just remember waking up in an ambulance and the nurse cleaning up my arms and telling me, you're gonna be okay. And then I think I just like blacked out again, and then I remember waking up in the hospital with my mom by my side. And then another time, which was I think only like a few months later, my brother was actually the one that recognized the fact that I was suicidal, and which blew my mind because me and my brother did not have any relationship growing up. All we did was fight. Like, we never got along. There were maybe like 2 times I can remember that we got along. So just the fact alone that he noticed that I wasn't okay just meant the world to me. But we came home one night and I immediately ran straight into the bathroom and attempted. And I remember my brother telling my mom that they should take me to the hospital, and I never went. I don't really remember much of what happened with that. That was one of the things that frustrated me about God the most, because at that point that was 3 failed attempts. And what frustrated me the most about God was he knew that I was suffering. Like, he saw all my pain. If there truly was a God, like, he knew that I was suffering. He saw the pain that I was feeling. And of course, I'm gonna want out of it because I was going through more pain than you would even think a human body could handle, a human brain could handle. So I was so frustrated and so pissed at God that he would not let me die. These weren't just like attempts where I was like, oh, if it happens, it happens. I was like, no, I am going to die tonight, but he just would not let me. And I was 17 years old when I found out the reason that God didn't let me die. After our house burned down and after my grandma had passed away, we found a house that was like 40 minutes away from where I grew up. And I decided to start a new school because I was like, yes, this is it. This is like my new beginning. But lo and behold, it just was as bad, if not worse, as my old school. So I ended up leaving public school because I was struggling a lot with my health. I was getting constant like infections or I was struggling with stomach issues. So one day I was just like at home alone while my mom and stepdad were at work and doing school. And I remember my mom came home and I was like, what? Like, why are you home? Because she had just left for work not that long before. And then my stepdad walked in soon after her and she sat down on the stairs and gave me the news that my brother had died the night before. This was literally the last thing that we were expecting because at this time I was a senior about to graduate and my brother was a year older than me, so he was in his freshman year of college and he was studying to be a pediatric oncologist, which if you don't know what that is, that's a children's cancer doctor. So like my brother was going to school to literally save children's lives and I was so worthless. Like at the time, that's what I believed about myself. Like I was the one that had no hope. I was the one that was so broken. I was the one that was severely depressed and that didn't have a bright future. So I was so confused and so angry at God. And I genuinely, with my whole heart, believed it was the wrong sibling that died. It was me that was supposed to die, not my brother. But the very first thought that I had on my mind when I got the news was, oh my God, is my dad okay? Because my dad had literally just gotten home like that day from burying his brother, my uncle, who had committed suicide a couple days before. So, and my dad has gone through hell in his life. Like, he did not have an easy life, so I just genuinely didn't know if something was capable of pushing him over the edge. And this sounds really terrible, but I just would not have been surprised if that happened to him, because when I tell you my dad was suffering so much, like his entire life, that's an understatement. So my first thought was, is my dad okay? So I call him immediately, and then we leave to go to the morgue. And on the way to the morgue, we were in the car. My stepdad was driving, and my mom was in the front passenger seat, and I was in the seat behind her. And I was like leaned up to her, and we were like holding hands and crying and talking about like how could this happen or whatever, just whatever you talk about. And I'll never forget in that moment when I was just hysterically crying my eyes out. I just like sat back in my seat and I got this crazy immense feeling of peace just wash over me from my head to my toe. I never in my entire life have felt something like that, and even like to this day I don't know if I have. And I heard the words whispered to my heart, it's gonna be okay. And in that moment I didn't know what that voice was, but I trusted it. It was so comforting and it was so calming and it was so peaceful, and I didn't know how it was gonna be okay, but I trusted that voice and I knew it was gonna be okay. So fast forward, I decided to get plugged into the church that my brother and I had been attending like every now and then. And I just was surrounded by people that loved me crazily. Like they loved me so well. They were there for me. I literally could not have made it through the loss of my brother if it weren't for these people. They were just so good to me. So that's why I decided to get plugged in, and it literally changed my life. I was at every single youth service. I was at every single Sunday morning and evening. I was just there as much as I possibly could be. And they even took a missions trip to Nicaragua in 2016, and I decided to go to it, and it just like changed my life, and I got to get to know Jesus more. I got to learn more about him, and I decided to have an intimate relationship with him. I decided to live my life for him because I learned the truth about who Jesus is, and I learned the truth that God is a God of justice, and he hates that those things have happened to me. He didn't want them to happen to me. He was grieving with me when my brother died. He was grieving with me that my dad was abusive. He was grieving with me that I was clinically depressed and suicidal and addicted to self-harm. Like, his heart was so tender and compassionate to me during those times, and I just didn't know it. So learning this truth about God, I was like, of course, like, this is a God I want to serve. This is a God I want to live my life for. And while I was heavily getting involved with this church, my dad was getting super involved with another church. And I literally saw, like, right before my eyes, God turned my dad from an angry narcissist to one of the kindest and most gentle and soft men of God that I've ever met in my entire life. So it was like a crazy transformation that had happened to my entire family. I think especially for my dad, it was a wake-up call. And he just really changed his ways and became my best friend. That sounds crazy to say, but he was. He became the dad that I needed all along. So I was super involved. I was heavily involved for years. I served at the church until I think it was 2019 when I made the decision that I want to be a missionary full-time. So I went off to a small missionary training university called Bethany Global University in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I was there for, I think, 3 years maybe. And when I tell you, they were the best years of my life. I was majoring in Bible and theology and intercultural ministries. And all day, every day, I just was learning about Jesus. I was learning about his word. I was in the prayer room. I was surrounded by community, people that genuinely loved Jesus so much. After I left, I had such a burning and such a desire to go back because there's no healthier place. Like, of course it's not perfect. Of course it's still filled with broken people, but it just was so healthy. And they had something called PMAs, which were prayer ministry appointments, which is just 2 hours of just intercession. You're with like a professional or whatever, and then you're with a scribe. So it's just 2 hours of like whatever you needed. If it was deliverance, if you needed to walk through forgiveness, if you needed to pray through trauma, literally anything. And I got so much healing and deliverance there. And that was the place that I actually got delivered from my sexual past. There was a specific appointment where we did this prayer ministry called Heart is Home, which just basically means you close your eyes and you ask Jesus to show you the room of your heart that you need healing in or you need deliverance, and then he'll take you to that room, and then it's different for everybody, but basically what happened for me is he took me to the room of impurity. I don't know if I'm going to get into too many details because it's just a really sweet moment that I have between me and the Lord that I don't know if I want to share with everybody, but that was the moment that I got full deliverance and healing from shame. After I left, I never have felt shame again in my entire life. I have never even looked back at my sexual past. I was fully delivered that day. So while I was at BGU, I met an oncoming student. I think I was a sophomore at the time, and he was coming in as a freshman, and we just clicked really well. And long story short, we ended up dating. I think we dated for almost a year, and it was a really hard relationship because there was so much sexual tension and temptation that we fell into multiple times. So it was really discouraging because I had just gotten delivered from a sexual history, and then I fall into it again. Thank God we never had sex, but there was so much temptation. And it just wasn't a healthy relationship, and I didn't even know it at the time. I genuinely, with my entire heart, believed that he was the one. I loved him more than anything, more than I've ever loved anyone in my entire life, until we had a conversation about our sexual sin. I just made it so clear to him that I just wanted no part in it. I just didn't want to continue in the sexual sin. So I remember there was a time, and I'm not going to get into details, but there was a time where he sexually assaulted me. I told him I didn't want it. I didn't want him to touch me, and he did anyway. And I'll never forget how I felt sitting on his floor, just bawling my eyes out as he was just sitting on his couch, just whatever, just not even caring about, or maybe not even recognizing the fact that I said no. But even though that happened, I didn't realize it at the time that it was sexual assault, because I didn't know that somebody that you're dating can sexually assault you, which sounds obvious, but when you're so blinded by love, you're just naive, and I didn't realize it while I was in the relationship. So I kind of just like brushed it off, and I was like, whatever. So while I was in college, I still kept up with my dad a lot. We talked probably like every other day. He was still my best friend, and I loved him so much. There was about a year before this relationship, there was an incident that happened where he was found in his home unconscious. So he was rushed to the hospital. I got the call. Somebody called me and was like, hey, just letting you know, your dad's in the ER. It's not looking so good. And then me, like, as somebody that had watched my dad almost die, like, dozens of times growing up, we spent so much time together in hospitals. And, like, when I say dozens, like, I'm not even exaggerating. And I just was like, okay, yeah, like, what else is new? Like, he's always in the hospital, he's always in the ER. But then they were like, no, this time is different, like, you need to come. So I flew out the next day, and it was one of the hardest days of my entire life because he was still unconscious when he was at the hospital, and he was still unconscious when I was on my way, because I was flying from Minnesota to Michigan. And it just was the most horrifying plane ride of my entire life because I obviously couldn't use my phone. So if someone were to call me and tell me the news, like, I wouldn't know, like, I wouldn't get the phone call. So it was like the most horrible 2-hour plane ride of my entire life. But I just remember praying so hard and asking the Lord to show me scriptures, and he did. He showed me the scriptures that my heart needed in that moment. And when I landed, I went immediately to the hospital. When I walked into the room, he just got this big smile on his face, and the nurse was like, wow, like, that was the first time I had ever seen him smile. So that just shows like how special a relationship we had. I knew with my entire heart that just me being there, just my presence would make him fight for his life even harder, because my dad had always believed that the Lord would heal him, always. He never gave up, but I knew, especially me being there as the light of his life and as his pride and joy, he was going to fight so much harder. So I knew I had to be there. And come to find out, he had sepsis he got a port put in his heart, and he got an infection, and it developed sepsis, and he almost died from it. And after that happened, his liver started failing, his kidneys started failing. So after that, he was put on dialysis. All these things that I don't really know like medical terms too, but after a few days and after I knew he was going to survive, I decided to head back to college. And after I came home, I think maybe almost a year went by when my dad told me that he feels good enough to come and visit me. He was on dialysis, I think, every other day, ever since that incident happened, but he decided he wanted to come see me because he missed me and he wanted to meet my boyfriend at the time. So he made the trek all the way from Michigan to Minnesota, which was a 14-hour drive there and back. So like maybe over 35 hours or whatever, I don't know, 30 hours in total. And we were able to spend a weekend together, and it was so fun. And then pretty soon after my dad had left to go home, my boyfriend had broken up with me, and the first person that I called was my dad. I told him the news, and he just sounded so genuinely heartbroken for me and so sorry. And a couple days after the breakup, I decided to go stay with my mom for a little bit. She was living in North Carolina now. After I moved to college, she moved to North Carolina, and I decided to just stay with her for a little bit. And I take the time to just heal and grieve, because it was a small university, so I would see him everywhere I went, and I would get panic attacks. Like one time I literally had to go to the hospital because I genuinely thought like I was dying, and it just was not good on my mental health and my health in general. So I just decided to take some time to breathe and stay with my mom. So I landed on a Tuesday, and I was able to just spend a couple days just like relaxing. We went to like an apple orchard, doing things that I love, and just like I was genuinely feeling so much better when on Thursday morning I was getting a phone call, and on the phone it said Pastor Mike, which was our pastor. And as soon as I saw his name pop up on my phone, I knew exactly what he was going to tell me, and I was right. He had told me that my dad had gone home to be with Jesus. So pretty much right after that, I flew back home to Michigan, and I took care of the funeral, like took care of all the things, had the funeral, and then I go back to university. And pretty much as soon as I got back, I went up to the PMA office to get prayer. I needed it so desperately, because not only was I grieving the loss of the love of my life, but also my dad. And I just did not know how to deal with that and how to cope. So I went up there and I was sobbing my eyes out, and the girl started praying for me, and as soon as she started praying for me, God gave me a vision that changed how I view the Father forever. So I was sitting on the couch like this, and I got a vision of the Father sitting next to me. He was sitting to my left, but he was face towards me. And as there were tears streaming down my face, I saw him like rest his head on mine like this. And as his head was resting on my head, there were also tears streaming down his face. And he was saying, "Daughter, I am crying with you. I am grieving with you. I am mourning with you." And in that moment, I felt so much more comforted than I knew was even possible. And this was right before Christmas break. So during Christmas break, I went back to my mom's to spend break with her. And the first part of me going back was so hard. I don't think I've ever walked through so much pain and grief in my entire life. And keep in mind, I was still clinically depressed at this time. I was struggling so much with my mental health, and it was December of 2019, and I was at my mom's apartment. That was the last time I had ever attempted suicide. And I will never forget, right before I attempted, I told God, if all you have in store for my life is pain, I want out of it. And then I attempted, and I was, obviously it was another failed attempt, and I was just so angry at God, and so much pain, and hurting so much. And I actually had a really close friend at the time that lived in Florida, and as soon as he found out that I was struggling to this extent, he drove up and spent time with me. I genuinely don't even know if I would still be here if it weren't for him. He was literally the only friend that I had to come through and to be there for me, and I was just struggling so severely. When I was staying with my mom, she would have to leave for work, and I wasn't working and I wasn't in school, so I just decided to spend my time at coffee shops. And when I was home alone, I literally would just blast worship music, and I just would spend like all day every day with the Lord. Literally from the moment I woke up to the moment I fell asleep, I was spending time with the Lord and allowing him to heal me and allowing him to minister to me. And it was genuinely the sweetest time with the Lord that I ever had in my entire life. I was more intimate with him in those moments that I've ever been in my entire life. So after winter break was over, I go back to university, and I get invited to this like retreat in Texas with like influencers, YouTubers, pastors, worship leaders, just really awesome people, and I decided to go. And I got so connected, and I fell in love with the people that I had met. While I was there, I had a friend that lives in Dallas who is a DJ for Christian rappers, and he had invited me to this like little show that he was DJing, just like a little Christian concert or whatever. So I got to hang out with him there, and I met one of his friends, Elliot, and me and Elliot just like connected very well. Like, After I was only in Texas for a couple days, but during those couple days we hung out and we just really connected. But at the same time, obviously I was freshly grieving a breakup and the loss of my dad, so I just was not interested in anything romantic. So after I had gone back to university, we just stayed in touch. That was in February of 2020, and it was that same month that I had decided to make the move down to Dallas. A couple of the girls that I met at the retreat were looking for a third roommate, and I was like, hey, why not? So I didn't really have anything keeping me at BGU because I just wasn't going to finish my degree. So I was like, well, I just need to find somewhere else to go. So I decided to make the move to Dallas, and I call Elliot because that was when COVID hit. In early March is when COVID hit and my university shut down, and I was planning on moving in May. So I call him freaking out and I'm like, hey, I'm supposed to be moving in May, but they're telling me I have to go now, and I literally have no way of getting there because I didn't have a car, I couldn't afford a plane ticket, I had all my stuff anyway, and I was like, I don't know what to do. So he's like, hang on, let me call you back in a few minutes. So he calls me back a few minutes later. He's like, hey, so I found a couple of guys who are willing to make the drive to come and pick you up. So we're gonna come pick you up like tomorrow. So they make the drive, they pick me up, they pack all my stuff, and when I got in the car, I sat next to Elliot, and that's when I heard the Lord tell me, this is my future husband. So keep in mind, I have these two major traumatic life events that I was dealing with, and then another one, which it wasn't necessarily traumatic, but it was a major life event where I was moving from Minnesota to Texas. I'd never lived in the South in my entire life, so it was a huge change. So I just was like struggling all around. The roommate situation I was in ended up not being good or healthy whatsoever, and all the while I was still suffering severely from clinical depression. But Elliot and we hung out all the time. Like, he was there for me, he loved me, he would call me to make sure I'm okay. And I'll never forget, one day he was just like over at our house hanging out with us, and I was just like so severely depressed. There was like a few weeks that went by that I was so severely depressed that I think I went weeks without even showering. I don't even know if I like barely ate. Like, I just stayed in bed. I didn't have a job. I wasn't doing anything. Except for sometimes I would go to the prayer room at Upper Room, but other than that, I just was so severely depressed. And I remember one time he came over, and it was so bad to the point where I ended up breaking my 5-year clean of self-harm. And I'll never forget, he knew something was wrong, and he just came in the bathroom, and as I was like a sobbing mess, he just picks me up out of the bathtub, and he carries me to my bed, and he just stays with me there all night, and he doesn't leave my side. And that just speaks so much about who he is. He just doesn't leave. So every single time I would go to the prayer room at Upper Room, I would tell God, I am not leaving this room until you heal me of depression. Like, I genuinely wanted nothing more out of life than to be healed of depression, because if you suffer or have ever suffered from depression, you know it is literal hell. It is one of the worst things anybody could go through. So I was so desperate for healing, and I just never saw it come, and I was so discouraged. But I knew that God is good, and I knew that he loved me, and I knew that he hated that I was suffering. And I just held so tightly to the promise that in Revelation 21:4 that says, there will be a day where tears will be no more, pain will be no more, and he will make all things new. So I just clung to that verse. So I remember one Sunday I decided to go to like their Sunday service, and during worship I had made the decision to just worship as if I'm not suffering. And for the first time in a really long time, I just worshiped and I danced before the Lord. And as I was doing so, the Lord told me to go get on my face before him. And as soon as I did, I got a vision of Jesus walking up to me, and he gets down on one knee and he places his hand on my head like this, and he says, "Depression isn't yours anymore." And then he takes his hand off of my head, and it's almost as if he pulls the depression out of me. And for the first time in my life, I could see clearly. Like, it's like I could see for the first time. Like, I opened my eyes and it was like a whole new world. I don't even know how to explain it, but it just was like, when you're suffering from depression, you're just so clouded. How you see things is clouded, how you think is clouded, how you function is just clouded. For the first time in my life, I wasn't depressed. That was 2 years ago, and I have not even come close to falling back into depression since. Depression literally ruled my life. Like, I struggled daily, severely with it. It almost took my life many times. So the fact that I was finally healed and finally free for the first time in my life, I just couldn't believe it. And there were a couple times where like I started to kind of slowly sink back into it, but the Lord was like, "Nope," and he like pulled me out so fast. Like, he would never let me come anywhere near depression ever again. And Elliot was there with me, and like this entire time Elliot is with me, and he's just a constant in my life. And this is something that just makes me fall in love with him, is that like no matter what, he is there. Whether we're out having a blast and having a super cute date night or whatever, or whether he's picking me up out of my bathroom because I self-harmed for the first time in 5 years, he's always there. He was always there. I knew he wasn't going anywhere. And I could just tell that his heart was just so broken for me, for all of the things that I had gone through in my life and was currently going through. He was so empathetic towards me. So long story short, we dated for I think about a year. He proposed to me on my birthday, and we were engaged for I think about 9 months, and we've been married for 9 months. And I'm currently in counseling, unlearning a lot of things that I learned in my childhood. I think I'm for the most part healed of the traumatic events that have happened to me, but I'm nowhere near healed of the childhood trauma in the childhood home that I grew up in, because I've struggled a lot to navigate the fact that I have fully forgiven my dad and I love my dad so much and our relationship was restored, but also the reality that he did abuse me and he did cause a lot of lasting damage in my brain, and I'm in the process of unlearning a lot of narcissistic tendencies, and I'm learning a lot of things that I should have never learned in the first place as a child. So this is the first time in my entire life that I am not actively suffering or grieving from something. And I was just processing that with the Lord a couple months ago, because I truly do not know how to operate outside of chaos. I never even knew how to have a relationship with the Lord outside of chaos and outside of grief and outside of suffering. So he's teaching me for the very first time in my life. I'm 25. For the first time in my life, to have a relationship with him in stillness and in goodness. And I'm just so excited to learn all the things about God that I should have learned as a child. And I'm just so excited to go to new heights and new depths in my relationship with the Lord. And I'm so excited to get emotional healing from my childhood. And I'm so excited to be emotionally healthy, especially for Elliot. So yeah, I know that was so much to unpack and so much to listen to. And I know at times it was so heavy. So please, if you ever need someone to talk to, please message me on Instagram. I would love to chat with you. But I'm not always accessible, so please find somebody in your life that can be there for you, that can talk to you, wise counsel, mentorship, close friends, whoever it is. So if you listened thus far, thank you so much for listening. That's my life, that's my testimony, and I'm quite literally living proof that God exists, God is good, and he is still in the business of miracles. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any of my content. Bye guys.